Bleak Faith Forsaken is a 2023 Souls-like action RPG developed by Archangel Studios, a small team of only 3 people. I played through the game 4 consecutive times and spent over 100 hours in it, so today I'm here to talk about what Bleak Faith has to offer and help you decide if it's worth playing in 2025. So first things first, the art design in Bleak Faith is really cool, and it's probably the best thing about the game. It's a surreal mix of Gothic architecture, industrial machinery, and Eastern European communist-era blocks that somehow works in a weird way, and it manages to create a truly unique look. It's cool, it's weird and confusing, it feels kind of like when you're dreaming and you feel like you're in a familiar place with familiar people, but you can't recognize anyone and there's just something off about everything. That's the kind of feeling that I got from playing Bleak Faith for the first time. It's moody and lonely, and the sheer size of its world alone can be intimidating. The game is filled with strange architecture, and the world is littered with imposing megastructures that stretch infinitely into the sky. But as cool and unique as the art style is, some of the later areas in the game lose that shine and end up looking a bit more average. The graphics, however, are not the best, and Bleak Faith often looks like a game from the previous generation. I played the PS5 version, and there's just something wrong with the lighting and colors in this game, and most of the areas you visit are bathed in this weird grey fog that looks more like a filter, and it makes the game look blurry and washed out. And you can actually see this filter being applied at the very start of the game when it transitions from the opening cutscene to the actual gameplay. 3, 2, 1, there, did you see that? See what I mean? Everything just turns blurry as soon as you start the game, and I have no idea why they chose to use this filter, but I think it makes the game look worse, so I'm not a fan. Performance-wise, it's a bit of a mixed bag on the PS5. Generally, the performance is quite stable, and the game manages to keep a steady 60 FPS most of the time, if you're not using any skills or magic, that is. If you are using skills or magic, you will experience heavy frame drops every single time you cast a spell, and Bleak Faith doesn't have a 30 FPS mode like most other games do, so what you see is what you get. The story in Bleak Faith is interesting, I guess, but I've played this game for 100 hours and I still have many unanswered questions. In true Souls-like fashion, the story is cryptic, but perhaps a bit too cryptic at times. The premise is basically, crusade gone wrong, now you're here and you have to pick up the pieces.
This crusade is not only about the city.
Unfortunately, Bleak Faith doesn't do a very good job with its storytelling, which is mostly done through logs and documents that you find while exploring the world. The problem with these documents is that they spend way too much time describing locations, events, and feelings, so it does a good job talking about the crusade, the people involved, and describing past events, but it doesn't really tell you why all those people are here. It doesn't explain who the main character is, it doesn't explain why you have to do what you have to do, and it doesn't really explain any of these more confusing concepts and ideas outside of just referencing them over and over again. There are a number of different characters you meet throughout your journey, but again, they don't say much outside of making vague remarks or just commenting on the state of the world or its recent events. There are no side quests in the game, and 95% of its characters never move to a different location after you speak with them for the first time.
You don't talk much, do you?
The level design is good, for the most part. The game features a huge interconnected world similar to the one in Dark Souls 1, but without the seamless traversal, as transitioning between areas is done through a loading screen, at least on the PS5 version. But I've also watched some older gameplay videos for the PC version, and I've noticed that the world is seamless on PC, so I'm not sure whether this is a console-specific issue or an issue with the newer versions of the game. Some of the first couple of areas are huge maze-like levels designed like a spider web, where each path you take usually branches out into 3 other pathways that will eventually loop back to where you started, so it's quite easy to get lost and end up walking around in circles while you're trying to figure out where to go next. But some areas are huge empty spaces and some are a bit more linear, so getting lost is mostly an issue in the first couple of areas. There is plenty to explore in Bleak Faith. There's always some item to find if you decide to explore its every nook and cranny, ranging from weapons, armor and accessories, to upgrade materials and logs and documents that shed a bit more light on its cryptic story. But one big problem that I have with the level design in Bleak Faith is that it does very little to restrict where you can go, and at the same time it doesn't make it very clear when you're going out of bounds, which leads to exploration feeling inconsistent in a way. For example, in this area you can drop down from this ledge onto a bridge to find a small hidden area with an item waiting for you. But in the same area, you can drop down onto another bridge, and not only is there nothing to find here, but now you can't even climb back up, so you have to jump to your death and start over from the last bonfire. And the game is just filled with stuff like this in every single area, and sometimes you have no idea if you're exploring an area that you're supposed to be in, or you're wasting your time outside of the intended play area. And trust me, I've spent hours going out of bounds, if you can call it that, since there is nothing binding you per se. And there's miles of unfinished or unused parts of the level, and you can easily get on top of the map, underneath it, or behind it. There's barely any invisible walls in this game, and generally if you're asking yourself, can I get there? The answer is usually yes, you can. You can also use this to skip every single boss fight in the game, except for the final boss. So if you know what you're doing, you can easily speedrun Bleak Faith in less than 30 minutes. Now, of course, if you only stick to the main and obvious path, you might never have to interact with this kind of stuff at all. But if, like me, you're a weirdo who enjoys pushing the limits of exploration in games, you're gonna end up in some very interesting places.
I envy you. You're very brave.
So maybe saying I have a problem with it is not entirely accurate. I do and I don't, because finding creative ways to skip content is fun, but I also think that the lack of restrictions makes the game feel cheap and unfinished, and I don't think most people want to be able to step into broken textures territory. As I was saying before, Bleak Faith also has a thing for huge empty spaces, long bridges and long ladders, to the point where the devs actually added a skip mechanic that teleports you to the top or bottom of a ladder. The sense of scale is great, and Bleak Faith makes very good use of megastructures in the background that stretch so far up into the sky that you can't see the end of them. But the scale is a double-edged sword, and while the world looks great, running in a straight line for a few minutes without having to fight anyone is a bit boring. And whether it's long bridges or staircases, there's a lot of empty space in Bleak Faith, so compounded with its low enemy density, it makes for a very dull experience at times. Sound design is a bit mixed. Most of it is fine, but whenever you aggro an enemy, it sounds like they're coming up from behind you, whether they're actually 2 floors below or right in front of you, which is kind of annoying. The audio also tends to break up sometimes, but it doesn't happen frequently enough to be an actual problem. Voice acting is, again, a mixed bag, ranging from great performances like this guy,
To turn on his own so brutally. Sardar filth.
to immersion breaking like this lady who sounds like it's her first time reading off a script.
My cloak, my gloves, even my tools. What do they even do with such things?
Bleak Faith also features a very cool and moody soundtrack, but the game has around 15 to 20 tracks that it keeps repeating over and over again across multiple levels, so you're gonna hear the same tracks played over and over and over again from start to finish. Generally, even when you fast travel from one area to another, the music never stops playing because none of the tracks are specific to a single area, which I find very strange because the game's areas are quite distinct, as are some of the tracks as well. So I think each area should have its own specific track, or at least set of tracks, as that could help set the mood and atmosphere for each area. And speaking of atmosphere, the general vibe of Bleak Faith is good, but it's certainly not as strong as I thought it would be, judging from the trailers and other people's reviews. Visually, I think the game does a very good job with its intricate architecture and bleak color scheme. The megastructures surrounding the world are intimidating, its narrow streets and poorly lit stairways make you feel claustrophobic in open spaces, and there is a permeating sense of desolation everywhere you go. But when it comes to its sound design, most areas don't do anything beyond a basic weather sound effect like wind or rainfall. I mean, just look at these different areas in the game. Everything just sounds the same. And there's even areas that have absolutely no background noise, like this one. Bleak Faith also uses a lot of descriptive text in its logs and journals, but it feels like it was written before the devs started working on this game, as most of the areas described in the text you find look and feel completely different in reality. For example, there is this area called the Asylum, which is described in the notes you collect as this dark and oppressive place with dim flickering lights and twisted apparatuses, where you find grotesque amalgamations of flesh and metal, where you can hear the muffled cries and the dissonant hum of the experiments, and where a chilling and unearthly wail reverberates through the walls, a cry of a banshee. But when you get there, all you can find is a couple of well-lit streets and old buildings. There are no twisted apparatuses, no failed experiments, no muffled cries or anything of the sort, no trapped victims crying for help or banging on doors. You fight the same enemies from previous levels, and while you do eventually find and fight the so-called banshee, it doesn't wail or cry or whimper. It's just a regular level with reused enemies. And that's usually the case for most of these descriptions. It feels like they're painting an entirely different picture than what you actually experience in the game. In terms of gameplay, Bleak Faith is pretty much what you'd expect from a Souls-like game, with a few differences. For example, similar to Elden Ring, Bleak Faith has dedicated jump and crouch buttons, but unfortunately you can't attack while jumping, and sneaking around is not very useful because there is no backstab mechanic in the game, but I'll talk about that a bit later. There are different weapon classes and types in the game that fit within the labels of melee, ranged or magic. The same melee weapon types have identical movesets, so for example, every dual-wield weapon has this moveset specifically. Weapons usually have light and heavy attacks, but the number of swings in your light or heavy combo is determined by the weapon. So you might notice that some weapons have 4-hit light combos, while others have 3. Or some weapons have 3-hit heavy combos, while others only have 1. So weapon types in Bleak Faith are not equal. If you're using a staff, for example, you get access to both light and heavy attacks, and you can also aim and shoot magic projectiles, while if you're using a bow, you can actually shoot enemies while you're in the air. You can also use a shield to block, which costs a bit of stamina and a bit of health, or you can perfect block on impact, which reduces the stamina cost and completely nullifies any damage. There is no posture meter in the game, you can't backstab enemies, and you can't open them up to a free visceral attack. So despite having a very generous perfect block window, I think the mechanic itself is high risk, low reward, and I personally never used it much. Another mechanic that is somewhat interesting is the chain mechanic. Basically, you can chain attacks together by timing your button presses to whenever your weapon lights up. A successful chain increases the speed and reduces the stamina cost of your attacks, while spamming the attack button drains more stamina and reduces the attack speed. It's a useful mechanic that is far easier to execute with large two-handed weapons, but I'm not a big fan of having to keep my eyes on my weapon in combat instead of focusing on the enemy. In terms of upgrading your character, Bleak Faith went for a more traditional approach. Basically, you kill things, you get experience points, you level up, and you get 2 stat points to spend in strength, agility, intelligence, or constitution per level. The level cap is 25 on your first playthrough, and then each consecutive playthrough raises the cap by 5, up to a maximum of level 40. The numbers sound quite low, but the game is balanced around the low level cap, so you're gonna feel like a beast at level 25. You can choose up to 4 perks out of a total of 18 available ones, and each perk can be upgraded once. Perks are basically your passive skills, and they really do make a difference in combat. Their effects can range from buffing your damage type to increasing your potion's capacity and effect, or even give you a chance to spawn a clone of yourself on successful melee hits. You can also have up to 4 active skills equipped, 2 that you learn using a consumable, and 2 that you get from your weapon. Well, perhaps learn isn't very accurate. You basically have 8 active skills always available to you and only 2 skilled slots. So anytime you want to assign or replace a skill in one of the 2 slots, you're gonna pay a cost in ability splinters, which you'll find laying around everywhere. Almost every weapon in the game has 1 or 2 passive or active skills, or a combination of both, but every piece of gear can be upgraded and modified, so there is actually quite a bit of variety and flexibility in terms of possible builds. The skills in this game are really cool and varied, so it was a lot of fun trying out different weapons just to see their effects. However, I feel like a lot of them become OP later on in the game, and there's simply not enough enemies to use them on, so I would have liked to see an increased enemy density on New Game Plus and beyond, which simply doesn't happen. In fact, New Game Plus is pretty much just a victory lap, which was kind of disappointing to be honest. I played a melee character for my first playthrough, then a Technomancer, which is the mage, for my next 3 playthroughs. Melee is fine when it works, usually against the weaker enemies, but it's also very janky, so ideally you want to DPS your way through everything as quickly as possible. This is the kind of game where you get used to the jank and you're able to control it, but the melee combat never feels good or satisfying even after you get used to it. On the flip side, magic is a lot harder in the beginning, as your staff's projectile spell eats up a lot of mana you don't have and deals as much damage as a normal melee attack. But once you get past a certain point, you'll easily one-shot 90% of the enemies in the game. Difficulty-wise, this is probably one of the easiest and friendliest Souls-likes I've ever played. In Bleak Faith, you don't lose anything when you die, enemies and bosses have very limited movesets, your healing and mana potions are craftable consumables that get automatically replenished when you're outside of combat, and the game is constantly showering you with potions that buff every aspect of combat and plenty of crafting materials, so you're never gonna run out of potions. The enemy density is also very low, and the enemy placement is never inconvenient. There are no cheeky archers in unreachable places, there are no traps or ambushes to fall into. Sometimes you'll run across a 500-meter long bridge, and you'll fight one enemy at a time every 100 meters. Other times you'll run across multiple bridges for entire kilometers and not find a single enemy. There are a few areas where you do encounter larger groups, but those are very few and far between. Bosses are a bit more challenging on your first playthrough, not because they're well designed, but because they usually have very large health bars, janky animations, bad hitboxes, and they can easily one-shot you. Like I said before, the quality is inconsistent. Some of the bosses are quite average, some are very bad, and some of the later ones are very cool. Overall, I think there's probably 2 bosses that stand out a bit more, while the rest are absolutely forgettable. But other than the jank, Bleak Faith is also very buggy. Larger enemies sometimes spawn under the floor, or get stuck inside of environmental assets like walls, trees, or pillars. The enemy AI is very dopey. Hitboxes are inconsistent, which sometimes works in your favor and sometimes against you. Sometimes your staff projectile fires backwards or to the side instead of flying straight where you're aiming. And the first time I got the final boss down to 20% health, it fell on the floor and went limp, so I had to shoot it with arrows for 5 minutes straight while having to reposition myself after each shot, because hitting the boss would ragdoll it across the room. But to be fair, I never experienced any crashes or major game-breaking bugs, so most of this stuff is just minor inconveniences. Oh, and your cape gets stuck like this constantly. Earlier in the video, I said I was gonna talk about crouching or sneaking and the lack of a backstab mechanic. Well, if you visit Bleak Faith's official YouTube channel, you can check out their Kickstarter reels, early demos, and dev updates from years ago. Most of what you see there never actually made it into the final game. And it honestly feels like an incomplete game, but it also explains some of the game design choices that may not make a lot of sense in the final version, crouching being one of them. Like I said, the game has a dedicated crouch button that is completely useless. You can't sneak up behind enemies, it's not needed in the main game, there are no tiny spaces that you need to crouch to get under, and after my first playthrough I just remapped my controls, removed it entirely, and replaced it with sprinting so I can sprint using the left stick. So then, why is it even in the game? Well, honestly, I don't know, but if you check out some of the early gameplay videos, you're gonna see that initially, the player was able to hide in tall grass, sneak up behind enemies, and backstab them for a lot of damage. Kind of like in Elden Ring or Sekiro. But none of this stuff made it into the full game, so there is no tall grass in the game, and the backstab mechanic doesn't exist. In fact, if you try sneaking up behind an enemy, they're just gonna notice you instantly if you get too close. The game also was supposed to feature a free climbing mechanic similar to Zelda Breath of the Wild that will let you scale any surface in the game, hence the giant buildings and cliffs you find everywhere. You can still climb on the backs of humanoid giants, but the mechanic is severely undercooked and janky, and it's not even necessary if you have a ranged weapon. It's a shame that many of their best concepts and ideas never made it into the full game, but the truth is that Bleak Faith is a passion project created by 3 guys, so in that regard it's truly impressive. The fact that 3 people managed to pull this off is definitely worthy of praise, but I also think the project was overly ambitious and the devs bit off a bit more than they could chew. Or at least it seems that way judging by the amount of cut content and mechanics, and the fact that the game was broken at launch and it needed over a year of patching to get fixed. But despite all the criticisms I have for it, I did enjoy Bleak Faith. It's a game I played for 100 hours, I did 4 playthroughs and I got the Platinum Trophy for it. It's not a bad game, but it's not a good game either. It's kind of mediocre but also kind of enjoyable. And there's just something about the world in Bleak Faith that made me want to go back and play more in spite of all the jank and bugs that soured the experience. Would I recommend it to any Souls-like fan? Definitely not. I think you're only going to enjoy Bleak Faith if you're the type of Souls fan who's got a really high tolerance to jank, who doesn't mind a few bugs, who can enjoy boring gameplay sections in games, and who values exploration over combat. If you can find some charm and enjoyment in games like Steel Rising, Hellpoint, or even Lords of the Fallen, then it's likely that you're going to enjoy Bleak Faith. But if you hate janky combat and you're looking for a polished combat experience similar to Lies of P, Kazan, or Neo, you will not enjoy Bleak Faith. Overall, Bleak Faith is an enjoyable 6 out of 10 game, and I'm happy that I got to experience it. There's some great art here to enjoy, good atmosphere, good exploration, and a lot of cool and memorable locations. Is it a must-play game? Probably not, but I feel like this is the kind of game that people will play 5-10 years from now and call it a hidden gem or a flawed masterpiece, and I don't necessarily think they'd be wrong. But this is all I have to say about Bleak Faith. This is my first game review, so I hope this video helps you decide on whether Bleak Faith is the right game for you. If you enjoyed this video, please backstab the fuck out of that like button and subscribe for more gaming content. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.